On a humid August morning in 1855, a young boy stood alone on the auction block in Savannah, Georgia. Not a single person in the crowd wanted to buy him. His pale skin and colorless eyes marked him as cursed, dangerous, a bringer of misfortune that no plantation owner dared to bring onto their land. The bidding began at $20, then $15, then $10. When it dropped to $5, silence filled the square. And then one woman raised her fan. Her name was Margaret Dunore, a widow who owned 4,000 acres about 12 miles outside the city. She paid $12 for the boy, claiming it was an act of Christian charity. The crowd applauded her generosity, calling her a saintly woman. But what they didn't know was that Margaret had been searching for a child exactly like him for 3 long years. And what no one could have imagined was that 73 people would vanish on her property over the next 14 years. Their fates were supposedly erased when local authorities burned the plantation records in 1861. But one ledger survived, hidden deep inside a foundation wall, uncovered during highway construction in 1959. Inside that ledger were cold measurements, bloodline charts, and something called the Purification Project. Before we continue the story of the albino boy and the secret compound where Margaret carried out her experiments, I need to ask you something. Subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell, because here we uncover the mysteries that history tried to bury. And leave a comment below. Tell us what city or state you're listening from. We want to know where our audience is hearing these dark stories from. Now, let me take you back to that sweltering afternoon when a widow's terrible vision first began to take shape. The summer heat in Savannah felt heavy, like a living weight pressing down on a crowd gathered at the waterfront slave market. Margaret Dunore arrived in her carriage, alone as always, a large, imposing woman whose sheer size commanded attention. In that era, such girth meant wealth and power. At 47, she'd been a widow for 13 years, running her late husband's plantation when iron would have made overseers uneasy and neighbors suspicious. But what truly set Margaret apart wasn't her appearance or even her authority. It was her library. Over 300 books on natural philosophy, anatomy, and animal breeding, with a special focus on heredity and selective breeding. The boy brought to the platform that day was around 11 years old, so thin that his ribs showed through his shirt. But it wasn't his frailty that silenced the crowd. It was his coloring. His skin looked almost translucent under the harsh sunlight. His hair was pale, nearly white, and his eyes held a pink-gray tint that seemed to look through people rather than at them. The auctioneer, Cyrus Peton, tried to hide his unease. "Lot 47, he called out, his voice lacking its usual cheer. "Male child, approximately 11 years old, from the Hutchinson estate near Augusta. As you can see, he has a particular condition." He didn't say the word, but everyone knew it: albinism. In 1855 Georgia, such children were viewed with fear by both white and enslaved communities. Many believed they brought crop failures, that they could see ghosts, or that they carried the mark of divine punishment. When the bidding opened at $20, no one moved. Peton lowered the price again and again, 10 and 5, but still no hands were raised. People averted their eyes, muttering prayers and signs against evil. That was when Margaret lifted her fan, slowly, deliberately, her expression calm, almost serene. $5 to Mrs. Dunore, Peton said, relieved to have any bid at all. Going once, going twice is sold. Margaret stood, opening her purse with exaggerated grace. "I will pay 12, she announced, her voice clear and steady. "It is our Christian duty to care for those whom others reject." The crowd murmured with approval. An old man called out, "God bless you, Mrs. Dunore." She smiled, the very image of benevolence. But as the boy was led to her carriage, her eyes studied him not with compassion, but with cold, scientific curiosity. The gaze of a naturalist examining a rare specimen. She had finally found what she was looking for. Subject 0 for her purification project. The boy, his former owners had called him Thomas. sat quietly in the corner of the carriage as they rode toward Belmont Plantation. Margaret said nothing. Instead, she opened a leather-bound journal and began writing. Notes on his age, the precise tone of his skin and hair, the color of his eyes in changing light, the measurements of his hands and feet. She observed him methodically, occasionally glancing up to study him before returning to her notes. Augustus, Margaret Dunore's driver, had served the Dunore family for over 20 years. His shoulders were tense, his jaw clenched tight. He had long since learned not to question what Margaret did. Among the enslaved people of Chatham County, Belmont Plantation had a dark reputation. Those who were sent there didn't return. They didn't escape because news of runaways always spread quickly. No, these people simply disappeared as if they had never existed at all. The carriage rattled to the pine forest, following a narrow dirt road toward a secluded part of Belmont that Thomas would soon know too well, a small compound hidden nearly a mile from the main house. The buildings there had been constructed between 1843 and 1852, carefully, quietly, with materials purchased in small quantities from suppliers across 3 different states. The laborers who built them were sold immediately after their work was done, scattered to plantations so far apart they would never meet again to compare stories. When Augustus finally stopped the carriage before the largest of the buildings, Margaret stepped down and motioned for Thomas to follow. Inside, the place was unlike anything the boy had ever seen. Clean pine floors, whitewashed walls, glass-paned windows that caught the afternoon light. Margaret led him into a small room containing a narrow bed with a real mattress, a chair, a small table with a basin, and a single wooden shelf. "This will be your room," she said. Her refined voice carried no warmth. "You will receive proper food, clothing, and shelter. In return, you will cooperate with certain procedures, medical examinations, measurements, and observations. Do you understand?" Thomas nodded, though he understood nothing except that obedience might mean survival. "Can you read?" she asked. He shook his head. "Can you write?" Another shake. "You will be taught," Margaret said, with a thin note of satisfaction. "You will learn to read, to write, and to understand natural philosophy. These lessons begin tomorrow. You may ask questions about your studies, but you will not ask questions about anything else you see or hear. You will not speak to others without permission. You will not attempt to leave. If you obey, you will be treated well. If you disobey—" Her eyes lingered on him, cold and unwavering. "Punishments will be severe. Do you understand?" Thomas nodded again, his small frame trembling. When she left, the key turned in the lock from the outside. Thomas stood motionless for a long time. Then, slowly, he sat down on the edge of the bed. He couldn't bring himself to lie down. Instead, he pressed his back against the wall, drew his knees to his chest, and waited for whatever would come next. Meanwhile, in the cool basement of another building, Margaret lit 2 oil lamps and opened her leather-bound journal. Dipping her pen in ink, she began to write in her precise, deliberate hand. August 17th, 1855. Subject 0 has arrived at Belmont. Initial observations indicate excellent quality for the purification project. Pure albinism confirmed in all physical characteristics. Begin preliminary. Measurements tomorrow, followed by educational assessment. Subject 0 represents a foundation upon which all subsequent phases will build. If theories prove correct, this acquisition validates 13 years of preparation. She continued writing for over an hour, documenting every detail she had observed about Thomas. To Margaret, he was not a child. He was a key, a specimen, the starting point in what she believed was the ultimate revelation of human heredity. And over the next 4 years, she would shape him, mold him, prepare him for a role so disturbing that when the truth finally came to light, it would haunt Chatham County for generations. Thomas's life at Belmont soon fell into a pattern, strict, cold, and unchanging. Each morning at 6 sharp, Margaret herself would unlock his door. It was a ritual, a demonstration of absolute control. She would enter the room with a measuring tape and a notebook, recording his height against the marks on the doorframe. Once each week, she weighed him on a scale imported all the way from Philadelphia. Once every month, Margaret conducted a full physical examination on Thomas, a procedure that lasted over an hour. She measured every detail of his body with clinical precision, recording his growth and proportions like data points in an experiment. After each morning's inspection came breakfast, a bowl of cornmeal mush, sometimes with milk or a touch of molasses. Margaret had calculated his exact caloric intake, the precise amount she believed necessary for optimal development. At 7 o'clock sharp, his education began. Margaret had hired a tutor, a nervous young man from Savannah named Christopher Vance, who visited twice a week to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic. Vance believed he was part of a progressive research effort, testing whether enslaved children could learn advanced academic subjects. He had no idea what Margaret's real project was. Thomas turned out to be a gifted learner. He absorbed information with remarkable speed, devouring lessons as if knowledge itself might be a form of escape. By the end of his first year, he could read complex texts, write with clean, confident handwriting, and perform advanced mathematics. Margaret appeared pleased, though her satisfaction was cold and mechanical, never affectionate. She assigned him books from her private library, anatomical studies filled with detailed diagrams, agricultural manuals on selective breeding, and treatises on natural philosophy that explored heredity and variation. But the true purpose of his education became clear only during her private lessons. Margaret would sit across from Thomas in one of the small classrooms inside the compound. Between them hung anatomy charts, skeletal diagrams, organs, the geometry of life itself. In her calm, measured voice, she explained her theories. She showed him how traits passed from parents to children. She displayed charts on horse breeding, demonstrating how strength, color, or endurance could be concentrated through careful selection. And then, seamlessly, she shifted to human heredity. Her tone never changed, as if she were still discussing animals. She spoke of races as developmental stages, of intelligence and beauty as inheritable qualities, traits that could, in her words, be improved through selective pairing. Thomas sat perfectly still, his pale eyes fixed on the charts. He had learned that interruptions brought sharp rebukes. Margaret never struck him. She didn't need to. The silence, the isolation, the total control she exercised over every aspect of his life, that was punishment enough. His only human contact came from Margaret herself, the tutor Vance, and occasionally Augustus, who brought supplies but rarely spoke beyond a few cautious words. What Thomas didn't yet understand was that Margaret wasn't simply educating him. She was training him, shaping his mind for a purpose he couldn't yet imagine. She wanted him to comprehend heredity, to grasp why certain pairings produce certain results, to understand and eventually accept the logic behind her experiments. Because one day when he came of age, Thomas would no longer be just an object of study. He would become a participant, a necessary part of what Margaret called the improved line. The compound, as Thomas would eventually learn, held others, though he rarely saw them. Through a small window, he sometimes glimpsed figures moving between the buildings, always under guard. He heard voices, sometimes muffled through the walls, sometimes sharp, breaking the silence of the night. And on certain nights, the sound were worse, crying, screaming, or worse still, a silence so deep it made his skin crawl. Thomas learned quickly, never ask questions, never look too long, never draw attention. At any given time, Margaret maintained around 25 people within the compound. Their faces changed often. She acquired them in many ways. Some were purchased for their unique characteristics. Others were given to her by neighboring plantation owners who wanted to be rid of troublesome or unwanted people. Occasionally, she brought in workers from her own estate, those who displayed traits she found useful for study. They lived in communal rooms, sleeping on rough pallets. They were fed, clothed, sheltered, but completely isolated from the outside world. Margaret kept meticulous records on every person under her control. Their measurements, health conditions, family histories when available, and the specific traits she judged as desirable or undesirable. Every pairing was arranged with chilling precision. Her charts tracked which combinations produce which kind of children. Over the course of 13 years, she documented dozens of births. But within those records lay something far more disturbing, a pattern of high infant mortality and too many disappearances to ignore. The truth behind those disappearances was perhaps the darkest secret of all. When children were born with what Margaret called degenerate traits, severe deformities, or any kind of weakness, they never lived long. Her journals claimed they had failed to thrive or expired due to natural causes. But after Margaret's death, witnesses told a different story. They spoke of infants taken away shortly after birth, never to be seen again. They described a hidden cemetery deep within the pine forest, each grave marked only by a numbered wooden stake. They described the copper-lined basement where Margaret preserved biological specimens in jars of alcohol, some of which appeared disturbingly human. Thomas knew none of this as a child. His world was confined to a few rooms: his bedroom, the classroom, the examination room, and on rare occasions, the small yard where Margaret allowed him brief, supervised exercise. She cared for his body with the same precision she gave to her livestock, ensuring proper nutrition, sunlight, and controlled activity. But it was not compassion, it was maintenance. As Thomas neared his 14th birthday in 1857, Margaret's lessons took on a new tone. She began to teach him about human reproduction in explicit, unsettling detail, using anatomical charts and preserved specimens. She spoke of conception, gestation, and birth with cold, clinical precision. She explained heredity, focusing more and more on Thomas himself. "You represent something extraordinary," she told him one day, her sharp eyes scanning him like an experiment. "Your albinism is a pure expression of recessive inheritance. If you are paired with the right subjects, ones carrying complementary traits, your offspring could be invaluable for understanding hereditary laws. You're not just a subject to be studied, Thomas. You're the key to the next phase." Thomas understood exactly what she meant, and that knowledge filled him with a deep, paralyzing dread. But there was nowhere to run. The property was surrounded by miles of dense forest, patrolled by overseers with dogs. Even if he escaped, where could an albino boy go in 1857 Georgia? He would be caught within days, dragged back, punished. Margaret owned him as completely as she owned her house and land, and the law protected her right to do so. But in the spring of 1858, while Thomas was recovering from a near-fatal case of pneumonia, something unexpected happened. Augustus, the driver, began talking to him. The conversations were brief, a few words here and there, always when Margaret wasn't around. Augustus would ask how Thomas was feeling, mention the weather, share small bits of life from beyond the compound. After years of isolation and sterile treatment, those small human moments meant everything to Thomas. Then, one humid afternoon in June 1858, as Thomas sat in the yard regaining his strength, Augustus lingered longer than usual. "You know she won't stop," Augustus said quietly. "Whatever she's planning, she won't stop. But you're smarter than most. You've been reading her books. Maybe you can figure out something she can't." Before Thomas could respond, Augustus turned and walked away. But his words stayed. They took root in Thomas's mind. For 3 years, he had done nothing, passive, compliant, resigned his fate, because until that moment, he hadn't seen another path. Pembroke's interest in Margaret's work deepened with every word she spoke. His medical background and genuine curiosity made him the perfect audience for her lifelong obsession. When they arrived at the compound, Margaret led him first to the records building. Inside, shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, lined with journals, charts, and anatomical diagrams chronicling more than a decade of her experiments. Pembroke's eyes lit with academic hunger as he flipped through a journal from 1847, documenting 3 generations of a single bloodline. "Extraordinary," he murmured. scanning the entries. You've maintained consistency across years. The level of detail is remarkable. He paused, frowning slightly as he turned a page. Although the infant mortality rate appears quite high, 37% in this cohort alone. Margaret had expected that question. Weak specimens, she replied smoothly. Those born with deformities or constitutional weaknesses, indicators of degenerate heredity. I have performed detailed autopsies on every case. The losses, while unfortunate, provided essential data, revealing which traits breed true and which signal hereditary decay. Pembroke nodded slowly. A flicker of discomfort crossed his face, but the gleam of scientific curiosity quickly smothered it. "And you preserved the specimens?" he asked. Margaret gestured toward the cellar door. They descended into the copper-lined basement. The air cool and metallic. Wooden shelves stretched along the walls, each lined with glass jars filled with clear preserving fluid. Inside them floated preserved organs, tissue samples, and disturbingly several tiny bodies. Infants, perfectly formed, no more than a few days old. Their faces, still and pale, seemed caught mid-expression, as if death had come neither gently nor willingly. "You conducted the autopsies yourself?" Pembroke asked, his voice quieter now. "I did," Margaret replied. "At first, I had assistance from a physician in Savannah. He passed away in 1851. Since then, I performed all examinations independently. My anatomical knowledge is self-taught, but more than sufficient for my purposes." Pembroke closed his notebook slowly, his tone shifting to one of solemn admiration. "Mrs. Dunore, what you have achieved here is extraordinary. The scope, the precision, the continuity. It's unlike anything I've seen. You must publish this work." Margaret shook her head. "Impossible. The public would never understand. I prefer to continue in private, advancing knowledge without interference." Pembroke hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Then perhaps we might collaborate. I could analyze your data, offer medical expertise, and design further studies. Together, we could produce results that would redefine our understanding of human heredity." Margaret studied him closely. Collaboration meant sharing control and risk. Exposure could destroy everything. Yet the temptation of recognition, of a true scientific breakthrough, was almost irresistible. After a long silence, she said, "Let me show you the crown jewel of my research." She led Pembroke through a narrow corridor and opened the door to a small, sunlit room. Thomas sat at a wooden table, reading from a medical text. His pale eyes lifted as they entered, shifting from Margaret to the unfamiliar man beside her. At 15, he had grown taller, though still slender, his white blonde hair cropped short. His skin, almost translucent, glowed faintly in the late afternoon light. "This," Margaret said proudly, "is Subject Zero, a pure albino, acquired 4 years ago specifically for this experiment. Every aspect of his development has been documented, physically, mentally, and behaviorally. He has received extensive education in anatomy, natural philosophy, and basic medicine. His health has been maintained meticulously, in preparation for the breeding phase." Pembroke's fascination was immediate and unmistakable. He approached slowly, his gaze fixed on the boy as if beholding a rare specimen. For half an hour, he examined Thomas thoroughly, measuring limbs, testing reflexes, inspecting eyes with various instruments. Thomas remained still throughout, his composure that of someone long accustomed to being observed, handled, and studied. Pembroke asked questions about his health, his vision, his sensitivity to sunlight. Thomas answered each with quiet precision, his voice calm and articulate, the voice of an educated young man, not a test subject. "You've taught him to speak properly," Pembroke noted, genuinely surprised. "And to read, an interesting choice." "Education serves multiple purposes," Margaret explained smoothly. "It allows him to comprehend the importance of the research, ensuring his cooperation. It also provides data on the intellectual capacity of albino subjects. And Practically speaking, as he matures, he must understand the breeding protocols thoroughly enough to participate effectively. Pembroke straightened up, his expression tightening. "You intend to include him in the next phase of your research?" he asked. "Yes," Margaret replied calmly. "He's now 15. Within 6 months, I plan to begin the developmental stage, pairing him with carefully selected participants to study hereditary patterns in a fully monitored environment. The genetic transmission of albinism is still poorly understood. By documenting each case from conception to maturity, we might finally see whether the trait repeats consistently, and what else may be linked to it." For the first time, Pembroke seemed uneasy. His eyes shifted from Margaret to Thomas and back again. "He's still quite young," he said slowly. Margaret's tone remained even. Across the South, young men his age already fulfill adult responsibilities. This will be different. Every step will be monitored and recorded for scientific purposes. Pembroke was silent for a moment, his professional curiosity at odds with some lingering discomfort, but ambition won. "What assurances do I have that every record will be complete?" he asked at last. "I've kept detailed documentation for 13 years, Margaret replied. "Nothing will change. Every case will be logged, every stage carefully observed. All developmental data will remain accessible to you." Satisfied, Pembroke nodded. "Then I accept your offer of collaboration," he said. "I'll visit monthly to assist and contribute my expertise. I ask only that my participation be credited when the results are published." They shook hands, sealing the partnership. Thomas watched in silence, realizing his fate had just been decided. The faint hope he had held, that Margaret might abandon her plans, vanished. She now had the approval of a respected physician, which meant her work would not only continue, but intensify. That evening, Margaret visited Thomas's quarters. "Dr. Pembroke is impressed," she said. "He believes our work could lead to a major discovery. You should feel honored to take part in research of this magnitude." Thomas said nothing. Her voice hardened. "You've received opportunities no one else here has. Education, food, safety. I've invested greatly in your development. It's time you fulfill your role." Still, Thomas remained silent. Margaret studied him briefly, then left, locking the door behind her. In the darkness, Thomas finally felt the full weight of despair. He was 15, utterly alone, trapped in an experiment disguised as science. Now, a respected doctor had validated everything Margaret believed. The path forward seemed inevitable. But Thomas had spent years reading Margaret's books, studying her theories, and had begun noticing something she and Pembroke overlooked. Their predictions were wrong more often than right. The results were inconsistent, the outcomes unpredictable. Margaret blamed missing data or hidden factors, but Thomas began to suspect something deeper, that heredity was far more complex than anyone understood, and her attempt to control it was doomed to fail. That thought gave him something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, not hope for escape, but hope that her own research would eventually expose its flaws. It was a fragile hope built on patience and time, but it was enough. That October night, Thomas made a silent vow. He would comply outwardly, but he would observe everything. He would remember, and if he ever lived long enough to see the experiment collapse under its own contradictions, he would make sure the world learned what truly happened in that hidden place. On November 18, 1858, Dr. Harrison Pembroke returned to Belmont with notebooks, instruments, and supplies, all meant for what he called systematic observation. Margaret greeted him warmly. For her, this was the beginning of something monumental. Thomas, meanwhile, had been fully briefed on the upcoming procedures. Margaret explained what was expected, using diagrams and manuals to outline her methods. She introduced him to 3 women from the compound, all selected according to her meticulous criteria. Each profile contained pages of notes: family background, health evaluations, physical descriptions. Margaret described how the program would proceed, that each parent would be observed scientifically, that every stage would be tracked with precision. Thomas listened silently, Hiding his dread behind a blank expression, he knew there was no resisting her. Margaret's authority was absolute, and now Pembroke's presence gave it the seal of legitimacy. The first woman, Eliza, was 19. Margaret's notes describe her as refined in features, her ancestry of interest for the study. Eliza had been brought to the compound 2 years earlier, after giving birth to a child Margaret wished to observe. That child had been taken soon after birth. Eliza had never seen her again. Margaret recorded her as cooperative, though the truth was something far more tragic, a quiet resignation born of loss. One cold November afternoon, Margaret brought Eliza to Thomas's room. Pembroke waited outside, ready to begin his observations, when Margaret signaled. She spoke to both of them with the same clinical tone she used when instructing staff, as if what was about to happen were simply another step in an ongoing study. Thomas endured these weeks in a state of numb detachment. Each night, locked in his room, he stared at the ceiling and tried to separate his mind from his surroundings, holding on to whatever small piece of self remained untouched by the rigid control Margaret imposed. He immersed himself in her books, reading obsessively, anatomical diagrams, scientific charts, breeding studies, anything to distract from the reality around him. He observed Margaret's records whenever he could, noting subtle discrepancies between her predictions and the actual outcomes of prior experiments. Margaret, for her part, was elated. The developmental stage with Subject Zero had begun, and she documented every observation meticulously with Pembroke's assistance. She calculated probabilities, predicted timelines, and outlined observation protocols for the pregnancies she anticipated. In her journal, she wrote long entries forecasting unprecedented insights into hereditary patterns. But nature proved unpredictable. Of the 3 women selected, only Eliza became pregnant. The other 2, Sarah and Hannah, did not conceive despite repeated attempts over subsequent months. Margaret recorded this in her data logs, attributing it to constitutional weakness, entirely ignoring or refusing to consider that stress and trauma could affect fertility. Eliza's pregnancy was observed with intense attention. Margaret and Pembroke examined her weekly, noting growth, development, and progress. They debated possible outcomes with scientific rigor. Skin tone, eye color, other traits, seemingly blind to the exhaustion and quiet despair that weighed on Eliza as the months passed. Thomas saw her occasionally, either from his window or during brief times when compound residents were allowed in the yard. He noticed the slow, heavy movements, the drawn face, the weariness that seemed to settle deep in her eyes. Once, their gazes met across the yard, and he felt the weight of her grief, an unspoken understanding of what life in this place meant, and the future that awaited her child. As May 1859 approached, Margaret prepared the compound's medical room for the birth. She had overseen many deliveries in her years of study, and this one was approached with particular anticipation. Pembroke arrived with instruments and materials for systematic observation. On May 17th, after a long labor, the child was born. A healthy baby girl, weighing just over 6 pounds, cried robustly. Margaret immediately examined the newborn under bright lamplight, noting details of skin, hair, and eyes. The child's skin was light brown, eyes dark, hair black. She was healthy and strong. Margaret's initial expression betrayed slight disappointment. Years of careful planning and preparation had focused on a particular characteristic, one that did not appear in this first offspring. Pembroke, making notes, reminded her, the characteristic in question is recessive. Both parents must carry it for expression. In this case, the mother does not, so normal traits appear. Future generations and careful selection will be necessary to study the pattern fully. Margaret nodded, already calculating her next steps. According to her plans, Subject Zero would need to continue participating in future research as opportunities arose. The focus shifted to long-term observation and careful monitoring of development, always under strict control and documentation. Thomas observed quietly, recording every detail in his mind. He understood that while Margaret's plans were grand and meticulous, The real world of heredity was far less predictable. Every discrepancy, every unexpected outcome, gave him a sense of possibility. Even in this controlled environment, uncertainty existed. And in that quiet knowledge, Thomas found a small spark of hope. The very complexity Margaret sought to master might one day reveal cracks in her plans, cracks that only time could expose. "Mrs. Dunore," he said carefully, voice tight with barely contained emotion, "what you describe is not scientific research. It treats people as objects rather than individuals. No data or knowledge can justify such disregard for human dignity." Margaret stiffened, her expression unreadable. "You are young and influenced by sentimental notions that have no place in scientific inquiry. These are enslaved people, legally my property, whose development I observe under my authority. Your moral objections are irrelevant." Chen met her gaze steadily. The law does not define morality. What is legal can still be profoundly wrong. This approach, treating human lives as instruments, is deeply unethical. History will judge harshly those who disregard basic human dignity. Hargrave attempted to mediate, urging caution, but Chen would not relent. "I cannot condone this, and I strongly advise you, Dr. Hargrave, to reconsider your involvement." Margaret's patience snapped. She ordered both men off her property immediately. They departed within the hour. But before leaving, Chen had a brief encounter that would leave a lasting impression. While waiting for Hargrave to collect his belongings, Chen wandered past Thomas's room. Through the small window in the door, he saw the pale boy sitting at his table, absorbed in a book. The sight struck Chen with an ache he could not explain. He knocked softly. Thomas looked up, startled. Visitors never knocked. "What is your name?" Chen asked through the window. "Thomas, sir." "How long have you been here?" "5 years, sir." "Do you want to leave?" The question was so unexpected that Thomas froze. After a long pause, he whispered, "Yes." Chen nodded, committing the boy's face to memory. "I will remember you, Thomas. I promise I will remember." Then Hargrave called to him, and Chen had to leave. Thomas watched through the window as the two men departed. He did not understand the significance of the exchange, but something in Chen's eyes planted a small seed of hope. During the journey back to Atlanta, Chen and Hargrave argued. Hargrave attempted to rationalize Margaret's actions under the guise of science, but Chen's moral certainty gradually wore him down. By the time they reached the city, Hargrave reluctantly acknowledged that Belmont's practices were troubling, though he refused to take action. Chen, however, had no hesitation. Within days, he began writing letters to medical societies, humanitarian organizations, and newspapers, detailing what he had observed at Belmont. He described the rigid control over residents, the meticulous records, and most importantly, the plight of Thomas, a boy whose life had been constrained and controlled from an early age. The response was discouraging. In late 1859, with sectional tensions rising across the South, few institutions were willing to investigate the internal operations of a Georgia plantation. Medical societies thanked him but declined to act. Newspapers refused to publish, citing insufficient corroboration. Even sympathetic humanitarian groups had limited resources. Frustrated but undeterred, Chen made a decision that would prove consequential. On December 12, 1859, just days after John Brown's execution sent shockwaves through the South, he returned to Chatham County. With ash still visible in the fireplace where Margaret had attempted to destroy journals, investigators realized she had not erased everything. Pembroke's detailed medical notes remained, documenting her observations and the strict protocols she had enforced. Most importantly, they found Thomas, 15 years old, articulate, and able to recount the full history of his life under Margaret's control. Pritchard was horrified. He had anticipated evidence of harsh treatment, perhaps some ethically questionable experiments, but nothing had prepared him for the systematic control over the residents and the meticulous documentation Margaret had maintained. He placed her under house arrest pending formal charges and ordered the compound closed. The remaining residents were moved to the county poorhouse temporarily while authorities assessed their situation. Thomas, given his unique circumstances and ability to testify, was placed under court protection. Margaret's response was immediate and characteristically calculated. She hired top-tier lawyers, experienced in defending plantation owners against accusations of cruelty. Their strategy was straightforward. Everything Margaret had done was technically legal under Georgia law. Enslaved people were property. Their owners had almost absolute discretion over their treatment, living conditions, and, as her lawyers argued, their development. The legal framework gave Margaret the cover to justify her actions. While Chen and Pritchard saw moral violations, in 1860 Georgia, no jury would likely convict a wealthy white woman for acts that were legally sanctioned, however morally troubling they appeared. Everyone involved understood this. Chen, Pritchard, and Margaret's lawyers alike. The case seemed destined for dismissal before trial could even begin. Then, unexpectedly, Harrison Pembroke, the physician who had collaborated with Margaret, came forward. Having lived in Charleston, struggling with guilt and isolation, he was compelled to act when he learned of the investigation. On February 8, 1860, he traveled to Savannah and provided testimony corroborating every detail Chen had reported. His status as a respected physician gave his word significant weight, more so than Chen's or even Augustus's could have commanded. Pembroke described Margaret's methods in precise terms, citing dates, observations, and procedures. He admitted his own involvement and expressed profound remorse, making clear that the work at Belmont was not legitimate scientific research, but a rigid, morally compromised system disguised as study. His testimony was compelling and difficult for the court to dismiss. With Pembroke's account added, the case against Margaret strengthened significantly, but her legal team adapted quickly, emphasizing again that, regardless of the moral questions, no Georgia statute had been violated. They prepared motions to dismiss the charges. Yet events beyond Chatham County soon intervened in unpredictable ways. Just when it seemed the full scope of Margaret Dunore's activities might be shielded by the law, broader societal currents, rising tensions across the South, public scrutiny, and the courage of witnesses shifted the balance. The investigation began to uncover truths that could not be ignored, truths that illuminated the conditions at Belmont more starkly than anyone had anticipated. This was the moment when the story of Belmont truly began to unravel, revealing not only the meticulous control Margaret exerted, but also the resilience of those she sought to dominate. And while the law of the time could not fully deliver justice, the documentation, the testimonies, and Thomas's own account ensured that the world would eventually learn the story in its full, chilling complexity. With ash still visible in the fireplace where Margaret had attempted to destroy journals, investigators realized she had not erased everything. Pembroke's detailed medical notes remained, documenting her observations and the strict protocols she had enforced. Most importantly, they found Thomas, 15 years old, articulate, and able to recount the full history of his life under Margaret's control. Pritchard was horrified. He had anticipated evidence of harsh treatment, perhaps some ethically questionable experiments, but nothing had prepared him for the systematic control over the residents and the meticulous documentation Margaret had maintained. He placed her under house arrest pending formal charges and ordered the compound closed. The remaining residents were moved to the county poorhouse temporarily while authorities assessed their situation. Thomas, given his unique circumstances and ability to testify, was placed under court protection. Margaret's response was immediate and characteristically calculated. She hired top-tier lawyers, experienced in defending plantation owners against accusations of cruelty. Their strategy was straightforward. Everything Margaret had done was technically legal under Georgia law. Enslaved people were property. Their owners had almost absolute discretion over their treatment, living conditions, and, as her lawyers argued, their development. The legal framework gave Margaret the cover to justify her actions. While Chen and Pritchard saw moral violations, in 1860 Georgia, no jury would likely convict a wealthy white woman for acts that were legally sanctioned, however morally troubling they appeared. Everyone involved understood this. Chen, Pritchard, and Margaret's lawyers alike. The case seemed destined for dismissal before trial could even begin. Then, unexpectedly, Harrison Pembroke, the physician who had collaborated with Margaret, came forward. Having lived in Charleston, struggling with guilt and isolation, he was compelled to act when he learned of the investigation. On February 8, 1860, he traveled to Savannah and provided testimony corroborating every detail Chen had reported. His status as a respected physician gave his words significant weight, more so than Chen's or even Augustus's could have commanded. Pembroke described Margaret's methods in precise terms, citing dates, observations, and procedures. He admitted his own involvement and expressed profound remorse, making clear that the work at Belmont was not legitimate scientific research, but a rigid, morally compromised system disguised as study. His testimony was compelling and difficult for the court to dismiss. With Pembroke's account added, the case against Margaret strengthened significantly, but her legal team adapted quickly, emphasizing again that, regardless of the moral questions, no Georgia statute had been violated. They prepared motions to dismiss the charges. Yet events beyond Chatham County soon intervened in unpredictable ways. Just when it seemed the full scope of Margaret Dunore's activities might be shielded by the law, broader societal currents, rising tensions across the South, public scrutiny, and the courage of witnesses shifted the balance. The investigation began to uncover truths that could not be ignored, truths that illuminated the conditions at Belmont more starkly than anyone had anticipated. This was the moment when the story of Belmont truly began to unravel, revealing not only the meticulous control Margaret exerted, but also the resilience of those she sought to dominate. And while the law of the time could not fully deliver justice, the documentation, the testimonies, and Thomas's own account ensured that the world would eventually learn the story in its full, chilling complexity. The legal battle dragged through March and into April 1860, with both sides marshaling evidence and expert testimony. And then on April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, and the Civil War began. Within weeks, all attention in Georgia shifted to the war effort. Margaret's case, which had been slowly grinding through the courts, was indefinitely postponed. Sheriff Pritchard was called up from military service. The judge hearing the case left to serve as a military advisor. The county records office, which had been compiling evidence, closed the staff enlisted or fled. Margaret, still under house arrest but no longer actively prosecuted, saw an opportunity. In June 1861, she sold Belmont to a consortium of investors from Savannah, claiming she needed to relocate for health reasons. The sale included all property except the compound buildings, which Margaret had quietly dismantled between April and May, burning what could be burned, burying what could be buried, and scattering other evidence across the property. The buyers had no interest in the compound. They wanted only the productive farmland. Margaret relocated Alabama to a small property near Mobile and disappeared from public record. The last confirmed sighting of her was in 1863, when a neighbor reported seeing an enormously obese woman living alone in a rundown house on the outskirts of Mobile. After that, nothing. She may have died during the war years, moved further west, or simply vanished into the chaos of a collapsing Confederacy. No death certificate was ever filed. No grave was ever identified. Margaret Dunore simply ceased to exist in any official record after 1863. Thomas, the boy at the center of Margaret's experiments, had a different fate. When the compound was closed in January 1860, he had been placed under court protection. Robert Chen, feeling personally responsible for Thomas's welfare, arranged for him to be housed temporarily with a Quaker family in Savannah. The Quakers, a couple named Daniel and Abigail Hargrove, opposed slavery and agreed to care for him during the legal proceedings. When the war started and Margaret's case was postponed, Thomas remained with his family. The Hargroves treated him with genuine kindness, the first he had experienced since being sold at age 11. They continued his education, taught him practical skills, and most importantly, treated him as a human being rather than a specimen. When the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1863, Thomas was legally free, though the practicalities of freedom for a 17-year-old albino boy in the middle of a war zone were complicated. He remained with the Hargroves through the war and the Reconstruction era. He learned carpentry and became skilled enough to support himself. In 1869, at age 23, he married a free woman of color named Rebecca Williams, and they had 3 children together. None of the children showed albinism. All were healthy and lived to adulthood. Thomas worked as a carpenter in Savannah for over 30 years, living a quiet life and rarely speaking of his years at Belmont, except his wife, who he trusted completely. Robert Chen continued his medical career, but the experience at Belmont changed him fundamentally. He abandoned research into anatomical variation and instead focused on public health, striving to improve medical care for poor communities in Atlanta. He maintained correspondence with Thomas for over 20 years and wrote extensively in private journals about the ethical responsibilities of physicians and the dangers of rationalizing cruelty in the name of science. He died in 1892 at age 57, still haunted by what he had witnessed at Belmont. Harrison Pembroke never fully recovered from his guilt over participating in Margaret's experiments. Though he continued practicing medicine in Charleston, he drank heavily and his mental health deteriorated. In 1867, he ended his life with an overdose of laudanum, leaving behind a note that referenced the unforgivable moral compromises he had made in the name of science. Though Margaret vanished and Pembroke and Chen paid their private prices, Thomas lived on. His survival, education, and eventual family life stood as quiet testimony to resilience and human dignity in the face of calculated cruelty. Belmont's story remains a shadowed chapter of history, suppressed and largely forgotten, yet preserved in the memory of those who bore witness and the journals that survived Margaret's destruction. It appeared that even after Margaret fled, her family's wealth and influence had been used to minimize public knowledge of what happened. The Georgia State Archives classified the journal as a historically significant document, but restricted public access to it for 10 years, until 1969, citing concerns about privacy and the sensitive nature of its content. When it was finally made available to researchers, it attracted attention from historians studying slavery, medical ethics, and eugenics in antebellum America. Several academic papers were published analyzing Margaret's practices as an example of how eugenic thinking manifested in the antebellum South. The case became a teaching example in medical ethics courses, illustrating the dangers of scientific rationalization for cruelty. However, mainstream historical narratives largely ignored it. The story was too disturbing, too complicated, too uncomfortable to fit into simplified accounts of antebellum Georgia. Thomas's descendants, who still lived in the Savannah area, learned about the journal's discovery through news coverage in 1969. Thomas had died in 1902 at age 56, having lived long enough to see his children grown and his grandchildren born. He had told his wife Rebecca much of what happened at Belmont, and she had shared some of it with their children, protecting them from the worst details. When the journal was made public, Thomas's grandchildren were in their 50s and 60s and finally understood the full scope of what their grandfather had endured. The family debated whether to speak publicly about their connection to the case, but ultimately decided against it. They were established in Savannah, had built good lives despite the barriers faced by African Americans in the Jim Crow South, and feared that association with such a notorious case might bring unwanted attention or harm. They maintained private family knowledge of Thomas's history, but did not contribute to public discussions of Belmont. The highway construction continued despite the discovery. The compound foundations were documented by archaeologists and then destroyed to make way for the road. The cemetery area within the highway right-of-way was excavated carefully. Remains of 61 individuals were ultimately recovered, including adults and children of all ages. All were reinterred in a single plot in Savannah Cemetery, marked with stone that reads, "In memory of those who suffered at Belmont Plantation, 1842 to 1860. May they rest in peace and never be forgotten." This story reminds us how easily scientific language can be used to justify profound cruelty, how legal authority can be wielded against the powerless, and how institutions can fail to protect the most vulnerable. Margaret Dunore's actions were not an aberration. They were an extreme example of attitudes and practices widely accepted in her time. The belief that enslaved people could be treated as property, that reproduction could be controlled and manipulated, and that scientific advancement justified any method. What made her case unusual was only its systematic nature and eventual exposure. And in that quiet knowledge, Thomas found a small spark of hope. The very complexity Margaret sought to master might one day reveal cracks in her plans. Cracks that only time could expose. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Margaret Dunore escaped justice, or did her guilt pursue her into whatever fate she met after 1863? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts. If you found this tale compelling and want more historical mysteries that illuminate the darkest corners of American history, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, hit the notification bell, and share this story with someone who appreciates lessons from history. Thank you for listening, and remember, the most haunting horrors are often those that really happened.